Yes, good evening, everybody. Once more, thank you very much, Jens, for the introduction. And I will start right away with a quotation of Fyodor Dostoevsky from Notes of the Underground, so over a century ago. We are oppressed at being men, men with a real individual body and blood. We are ashamed of it. We think it is a disgrace and try to contrive to be some sort of impossible generalized man. Soon we shall contrive to be born somehow from an idea. Well, this quotation from Dostoevsky seems prophetic. Being an ordinary person made of flesh and blood becomes more and more a defect. In the face of our machines, we begin to be ashamed of our own imperfection. This seems to announce a fundamental transformation of the previous image of the human, which we may characterize by the following features. First, evolution is understood as a process of progressive differentiation and optimization of life, but the outcome of evolution is contingent on each point in time. No one wanted us this way. So human nature can no longer be considered as a set constant. It is changeable and accessible to our own self-forming. Next, man in his past state of development is seen as fundamentally incomplete. The outcome of evolution is only a badly constructed, fallible product growing blindly. Human nature is therefore not only changeable, but also in every sense in need of enhancement. We should assume the responsibility for our further development ourselves, rather than, as until now, leave it to blind evolution and chance. And the third assumption is our bodies are fragile, vulnerable, subjugated by age, and frail. Mortality is the greatest imposition that nature has in store for us. And this dependence on bodily preconditions appears to be ever less acceptable. Overcoming it becomes the consummation of the emancipatory project of modernity. What is propagated to this end are various forms of optimization and upgrading of the body, the technological remodeling of human nature, and even the overcoming of death. For the last 2 or 3 decades, such ideas have found increasing prevalence under the term of transhumanism or posthumanism. Transhumanists see the opportunity to optimize inadequate human nature in bio, nano, and computer technologies. Each person should have the right to define and expand his psychic or physical capacities, his sex, his appearance, or his intelligence, according to his will. On another level, transhumanists such as Moravec, Kurzweil, Nick Bostrom, and others predict that we will see the fusion of man and machine. Cyborgs should form the next stage of evolution and lead us to summits of intelligence and life expectancy that are unimaginable today. Such utopias find philosophical support in functionalist theories, according to which the human mind ultimately exists as an informational and data structure. Information is, however, in principle transferable and is not bound to a particular corporeal basis. Information not only uses the brain as a substrate, but also external prostheses, memory storages, or computer systems. Humans are therefore, in the words of philosopher Andy Clark, natural-born cyborgs. And there is nothing contradictory in the mixture of technology, brain, and body, because the mind itself is already thought of as an analogy of a technical system. And as Bostrom writes, various pharmacological, genetic, or digital techniques of enhancement may make us, or our descendants, post-human beings, who may have indefinite health spans, much greater intellectual faculties than any current human being, and perhaps entirely new sensibilities or modalities, as well as the ability to control their own emotions. Such promises extend to the idea of transferring one's mind to other substrates in the form of pure information, the well-known mind uploading idea. So we could connect our brain to a computer, do away with our old body, composed of skin and bone, and finally attain digital immortality. Up until now, in the words of Kurzweil, our mortality was tied to the longevity of our hardware. When the hardware crashed, that was it. As we cross the divide to instantiate ourselves into our computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. We will be software, not hardware. By this, transhumanism radicalizes a view of the human body which is widespread in both the life sciences and the humanities. It is the conception of the body as an objectifiable vehicle or apparatus, which is external to ourselves and subject to our free disposal and manipulation. This mechanistic view of the body is the counterpart to the functionalist view of the mind as pure information. Transhumanism is thus based on a radical dualism of body and mind, and what it wholly misses is a fundamental structure of human existence, namely vitality and embodiment. Humans, so I will argue in the following, are neither biological machines nor pure minds, but they are first and foremost living bodily beings. So being bodily is not something external to us, but is rather the foundation of our existence. Precisely because all feeling, perception, thought, and action is a form of our embodied enactment of life. At the same time, of course, humans are beings with the ability to take stances towards their corporeality. And that means to form also an instrumental relationship with their body. But they can therefore neither ignore it nor annul it. Rather, they must form, cultivate, and integrate their corporeality into their ideas of a good life. A comprehensive defense of embodied human nature certainly demands a far more extensive discussion than is possible for me in this context. Of the manifold proposals and visions of human optimization, I will therefore single out the most prominent, namely that of mind loading or digital immortality. I will look at the issues of functionalism and neuroreductionism in this context. From there, a light will also be shed on the less revolutionary variants of human enhancement, which only aim at a limited transformation of human nature, but which are equally based on a dualism of mind and body. Now, what is mind uploading? In short, it means detaching consciousness from the biological organism and transferring it to a digital system. In the words of Sandberg and Bostrom, the basic idea is to take a particular brain, scan its structure in detail, and construct a software model of it that is so faithful to the original that when run on an appropriate hardware, it will behave in essentially the same way as the original brain. And if successful, the procedure would lead to a qualitative reproduction of the original mind with memory and personality intact onto a computer where it would now exist as software. And this digital intelligence would then occupy a cyborg or an android, or would even live in virtual reality, becoming, in principle, immortal. In support of this, transhumanists usually point to the allegedly foreseeable possibility of connecting the brain to microchips, the signals of which feed into the neural network. And this would not only further our abilities on an unprecedented scale, but also allow us to gradually outsource consciousness to external structures. Of course, all this is far from realization, and it is indeed highly questionable whether connecting the brain to an electronic data storage is even possible. Present brain-computer interfaces work solely through very global recording of brain activity through EEG or electrodes in the skull. The signal patterns are processed by computers and enable the subjects to direct a cursor on a screen, for example, or to operate a robot arm by means of mere imagining of movement. However, the reverse direction, the injection of specific signal patterns into the brain, is so far completely impossible. And thus, also in the future, we will continue to acquire foreign languages only through learning and practice, and not through ordering a program from Amazon and downloading it onto our brain. It is adventurous enough to meditate on the thought that we could somehow scan or copy the structure of the brain with its over 100 billion neurons and multiple hundreds of trillions of synapses. This thought becomes fantastic, however, if one considers that indeed we need to capture not only the structure, but also the entire continuously variable activity of the system as a whole, right up to the transmitter release in the individual synapses. Here it is hard to say what should be scanned at all. The firing of neurons may to some extent still be presented as digitizable information, so on and off equals 0 and 1. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. In all processes below this level, there are analog, molecular, and atomic processes with quantum physical fuzziness, which are in constant flux. So one could just as well try to copy a waterfall. But let us leave aside such objection and devote ourselves to the foundational ideas of mind loading. Obviously, we're dealing with a peculiar amalgam of materialism and idealism. On the one hand, consciousness is reduced to the neural processes of the brain and thereby materialized. On the other hand, it is considered as the pure form of this process, namely as the pattern of information which can be detached from the substrate and transferred to other systems. And this functionalism, which I mentioned before, is nothing other than an idealism of information. Mind as pure form. However, both assumptions, the materialistic and the idealistic, are equally blind to the vital reality of the embodied person. And in what follows, I criticize first the functionalist and then the neuro-reductionist prerequisite of a transfer of consciousness. The idea of mind uploading equates the mind with the totality of algorithmic processes in a complex system such as the brain. In other words, with a software. And this corresponds to the common concept of cognitive science as well as artificial intelligence, namely functionalism. And here, mental states, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, wishes, are defined through functional connections of input and output of the system. So he who stabs his finger, for example, enters a mental state which leads to moaning and the withdrawal of the finger. Pain is then nothing other than the state of the brain which results in this output. And this state can be described as a certain amount of data. Consciousness is thus the byproduct of a neural calculation, an algorithm. A basic principle of functionalism is substrate independence. If the mind is made up of algorithms and data structures, then it can run as software on every sufficiently complex hardware, whether it be composed of carbon or silicon, of neurons or transistors and circuits. And this is because it is always only algorithms and information which make up the mind. Nothing material, nothing corporeal, nothing vital. The progress of artificial intelligence has granted functionalism an enormous boost. The power of human intelligence does not seem to be bound to the brain, let alone to consciousness. Of course, no artificial system has the faintest idea of what it calculates or does. Manifestly, the decisive feature of pain, feeling, or thought is lost in the functionalist concept, namely experience. John Searle's classic Chinese room argument still remains relevant today. Even an artificial system that can translate Chinese perfectly or can find the matching answers to all questions in Chinese language according to its program still does not understand a single word of Chinese. Meaning cannot be reduced to functional algorithms if there is no conscious subject who understands what these algorithms mean. But the same applies to pain, to the taste of chocolate, or the scent of lavender. No qualitative experience as such can be derived from data and information. Consciousness is not the mindless traversal of states of data. At core, it is self-awareness. It is for me that I feel pain, perceive, understand, or think. And this self-awareness is not based on reflection, nor is it composed of intentional contents or information. Rather, it has already characterized primary experience, such as comfortable, thoughtless dozing in the warm sun. It is a basal sense of self that forms the background of all of our experiences, a feeling of being alive that springs from our corporeality and which manifests itself in well-being or indisposition, specifically in hunger, thirst, pain, or pleasure. And there is nothing to suggest that this vital sense of self can be reproduced in digital algorithms. Let us take the example of pain. The unpleasurable quality, so the painful element of pain, can be expressed neither digitally in zeros and ones, nor physically in negative charges. And this is because the difference between 0 and 1, or between plus and minus, only seemingly expresses a difference in value. In fact, this difference is only a convention. It does not imply anything negative, anything painful. All digital signs or physical states are themselves only pure positivity, facticity, and externality. And there's nothing to suggest that a system which runs them could experience something like pain, painful pain. The same applies for all striving, that being after something and being ahead of itself, which distinguishes conscious life. Artificial systems only go through states. They are not ahead of themselves, and they do not care for anything at all. Take the example of a cruise missile. It is equipped with a goal-detecting program able to modify the course of the missile according to a forward mechanism that minimizes deviation from the goal. Of course, the missile does not seek or discover anything. Each correction serves only the internal set point regulation of the mechanism and happens purely momentarily without referring in any way to a set goal in the future. For this goal itself, the mechanism remains blind and deaf. In other words, the affective core of consciousness, which makes us feeling and wishing beings in the first place, cannot be grasped by information theory. It is inseparably bound to our corporeal sensing and therefore also our biological existence. That which is comfortable or painful, that which is good or bad, cannot be expressed in an algorithm. Digital information carries no values. And whatever we take from the human brain in terms of data or information in order to copy or transfer it into an artificial system of processors and circuits, the outcome would only ever be sheer externality. An android or cyborg programmed with such data would in the best case be an unfeeling zombie. Immortality is generally conceived a little differently. The idea of mind uploading is brought to a state of complete absurdity if one thinks of the possibility of a multiple copy. Imagine a perfect digital reduplication of my brain in whatever substrate. That this would, per impossibility, actually restore my subjective experience. Now, if this were the case, then the process could be repeated. I could be replicated twice or 3 times and more. Now, in which of these clones would my original first-person experience be located? Each duplicate would claim to be me, would remember my life, would continue my identity. Who among them would be my real successor? Well, of course, I do not want to further pursue such abstruse thoughts. At the latest here, it is obvious that the idea of using the brain as a blueprint for immortality has nothing to do with reality, but rather much more with the naive belief in the computer model of the mind. The human person is not a copiable sum of data, not a digital program, but rather a living and experiencing being. Now, the second prerequisite of mind uploading is the identification of brain and person. In a typical formulation, all that makes up a person, such as their mind, their consciousness, emotions, memories, their identity, is physically saved in the structure and the processes of the brain. You can find many quotations like that. I've only taken one. And this neuro-reductionist view, widespread today, is also crystallized in the thought experiment of the brain in a vat. A brain removed from the body by an effective neuroscientist could be kept alive in a nutrient solution and be fed appropriate information by a supercomputer such that it could produce the same experience, the same world, the same self as it allegedly does now. We would not notice the difference. And this is because our experience, so runs the argument, is nothing other than a data structure in the brain itself, no matter where it is fed from. Yet the brain is not a closed system which only receives input and issues output. It is much rather continuously engaged in feedback interaction with the body and with the environment. And it is only through this constant interaction that conscious experience comes about. This is the core tenet of the paradigm of embodied cognition, with authors like Varela, Gallagher, Thompson, and many others. It regards consciousness and subjectivity as essentially embodied in the whole organism, not only embrained, and as situated or enacted through the ongoing sensory-motor interaction of organism and environment. And thus the mind is not regarded as an inner model of the world produced inside the brain, but as a particular enactment of the life of the organism as a whole. I've already mentioned primary, still unreflected experience, the vital sense of self. And this basal sense of self does not arise first in the cortex, but results from continuous vital regulatory processes involving the whole organism, which are integrated in the brainstem and higher centers, according to Panksepp and Damasio. The maintenance of homeostasis, so the inner environment and thus the viability of the organism, this homeostasis is the primary function of consciousness as it manifests itself in desire, hunger, thirst, pain, or pleasure. And this can also be expressed in the following way. All experience is primarily a form of life. And there's a direct connection between German Leben and Erleben, experiencing life. Without life, there is no consciousness and no thought. A possible counter-argument claims that vital processes need only be represented in the brain in order to be experienced, and then they would not be constitutive for consciousness. However, the integration which underlies conscious experience is based on a continuous circular feedback between the basal areas of the brain and the body. And these interactive circles do not permit the separation of representations from the represented. Damasio himself even speaks of a looped circuit where the body communicates to the central nervous system and the latter responds to the body's messages. The signals are not separable from the organism states where they originate. The ensemble constitutes a dynamic bonded unit. This unit enacts a functional fusion of body states and perceptual states, such that the dividing line between the two can no longer be drawn. The signals conveyed would not be about the state of the flesh, but literally extensions of the flesh. So the integration which corresponds to conscious experience is therefore not an image in the brain, but rather always includes the organism itself. As conscious beings, we are corporeal, embodied beings. In the same way, emotions are also bound to the constant interaction of brain and body. Moods and feelings always relate to the whole organism. The brain, the autonomous nervous system, the heart, circulation, breathing, muscles, facial expressions, gestures, and stance. Every emotional experience is inseparably bound to changes in the bodily landscape. And the same is true of all perceptions and actions, which result from the sensory-motor interaction of brain, organism, and environment. In other words, from functional circuits involving our senses, limbs, and equally things and other people. Again, there is no separable representation within these looped circuits which could model the environment. The brain is capable of integrating all of the organismic functions, but it is conversely reliant upon them. It is not a command center which receives information and issues orders, but it is rather a resonance or a relational organ for all these loops, a part of the functional whole of body and environment. I think now it is quite easy to see that the brain in a vat thought experiment fails. Even an extremely complex computer could never simulate the homeostatic self-regulation of the whole organism, all of the interconnections of neuronal, neuroendocrine, and humoral processes that involve the whole body. These processes are of a biological and biochemical nature and cannot be represented in digital information. Nor could a computer simulate all of the circular interactions between brain, the sensing, and the movable body, and the environment. Those very things on which our experience and action in the world are based. Even the European Union's Human Brain Project, that by 2023 hopes to achieve a computer simulation of the entire human brain, can only simulate what is suitable to be simulated. Electronic signal transmissions that can be represented algorithmically. But this has little to do with the actual activity of the brain in the organism, and especially not with consciousness. As John Searle once noted, ironically, even a perfect computer simulation of the brain would be about as conscious as a perfect computer simulation of a tornado would leave us all wet or blown over. So conscious experience presupposes corporeality and thus biological processes in a living body. Nothing of this is to be found in the Human Brain Project. A disembodied brain is thus as much of a functionalist fiction as mind uploading. Against such brain centrism, we may set the paradigm of embodiment. Consciousness is based on the continuous interaction between brain, body, and environment, and therefore it cannot be considered localizable at all, neither as an internal state in the skull, nor as a data pattern in the brain. Consciousness is the overarching activity of a living being in its relationship with the environment. In other words, it is humans who feel, perceive, think, and act, and not brains. Now, let us once again turn to the basic idea of mind uploading. I think it is even clearer now that behind the transhumanistic vision, there stands a conception of humanity as reductionist as it is dualistic. The phantasm of the fusion of mind and technology is an expression of an undercurrent of neglect, even of contempt for life and the living body. Freeing the mind from the material body is the solution that the present techno-utopianists set before us. Ultimately, they are the secular epigones of the Neoplatonic and Gnostic teachings about the body as a grave or the dungeon of the soul. The Gnostics of late antiquity saw in the arbitrary creation of the world and of man by the demiurge, a sort of anti-god, a descent from primordial divine light. In terrestrial life, the pure spiritual soul of man, the pneuma, becomes connected to the dark and foreign matter of the body, thereby becoming impure. Should the spirit now free itself from the body through purification and asceticism, then he can finally return to the pleroma, the sphere of light and divinity. Of course, from the transhumanist perspective, the pure mind exists not as pneuma, but rather as a data structure, as information. And as pure form, as substrate-independent structure, it should in principle be detachable and transferable. This functionalist thinking sharply separates the informational essence of the mind from its existence, and assigns priority to the former. However, this pure information is missing the decisive element of existence, namely concrete individuality. Information is freely convertible and arbitrarily transferable, yes, but it is precisely this advantage that is its fatal defect. Information knows no individual perspective, no place from which the world could appear to a subject. This place of concrete individuation, of perspective, is nothing other than the living body. It is the living body or the living being which forms an individual self, a self-reproducing and self-preserving unit, and which ultimately constitutes our conscious self-awareness. Transhumanists, in contrast, want, as Dostoevsky writes, to be born somehow from an idea. But the idealism of information is sterile. Mathematics or informatics do not produce humans. The mind does not exist in a pure form, but rather in the concrete being of individual existence, and this individualization requires a body. The mind is corporeal. The mind is vital, and it cannot survive in the dead algorithms and circuits of a computer. Only as bodily beings do we also feel and know what is comfortable and what is not comfortable, what is pleasure and what is pain, what is good and what is bad. And it is only the corporeal being in the world that makes possible the freedom which we possess in the terrestrial world. And this is because the body is the medium of our enactment of life, of all of our feeling, thinking, wanting, and acting. Transhumanists see our freedom differently. In their radical, dualistic, neo-Gnostic view, The mind must be freed because we are only contingently trapped in mortal vehicles. Against this, we can posit the concept of embodiment, namely that bodies are not prisons and minds are not angels, but that both are indissolubly entangled in one another. The mind can never be removed from the body and transferred to a computer. Our conscious experience, just as our personal identity, is based on the body, a body which we are. And this embodied, and therefore, of course, mortal individuation is the price we must pay in order to experience the possibilities and freedom of earthly existence. Let me sum up so far. Being a human of real flesh and blood seems more and more troublesome to us. As Dostoevsky said, this hostility towards the flesh today finds its expression in the functionalist cybernetic paradigm. Humans are information processing machines. Their consciousness and their personality exist as immaterial programs. Progress consists, in this view, in updating the deficient body by means of information and biotechnologies, and finally converting it into a synthetic product. And this is because the corporeality of our existence is one of the last resistors opposing digital progress. Our embodiment sets an unassailable border for all functionalist utopias. A being of flesh and blood is not representable in algorithms. And insofar as our conscious experience is constitutionally embodied, it also cannot be simulated, copied, or transferred in the form of information. All experience is a form of life. Radical transhumanist utopias fail because of their complete misunderstanding of what it is that life is. Now, the fact that corporeality and vitality are constitutive for our existence does not as such establish the unavailability of human nature. Just as we medically intervene in our bodies, we cannot categorically rule out interventions into our nature. Of course, mind uploading, digital immortality, will remain forever a utopia. But the insight into the constitutive embodiment of our existence sheds light also on less radical demands for enhancement and optimization. And here it can be shown that the idea of optimization meets with inherent contradictions. Shifting or displacing the proportions of human capabilities, which we have built up in the course of evolution, always comes at a high price. And this is because these natural assets always represent meaningful compromises, which have resulted from the conflicting demands made by a complex creature like the human in a variable environment. I won't go into too much detail, but I would like to name 3 examples. First, general enhancement of our powers of attention could be achieved by psychostimulants or transmagnetic brain stimulation, or also by biogenetics. On first view, it seems to be an undisputable advantage if we are dealing with speed of learning or professional efficiency. But attention is a precious gift, and many stimuli and possible objects compete for it. An excessive focusing of attention can lead to the exclusion of other objects, which are possibly also useful. Patients taking Ritalin, even today, a psychostimulant used to treat attention deficit disorder, report that the increased fixation on the respective task renders everything else secondary. Cognitive focusing increases, but the need for interpersonal relationships is decreased, as well as interest in new experiences, spontaneity, and creativity. So a general enhancement of human attention capacity would come at the price of a loss of openness, flexibility, and susceptibility for novelty. Thus, with this enhancement, we are faced with a typical conflict of optimization, but one which characterizes all other purported enhancements. The same, to take another example, applies to the increase of powers of memory. The ability to memorize much or everything seems self-evidently to be a win, and in many ways it is. But he who memorizes everything can no longer forget anything. Forgetting relieves us from an overflow of details, so that the significant memories can emerge first and foremost. It is only also forgetting that allows us to neutralize the ever overpowering effect of the past, an effect that would otherwise only ever grow in life. Only through forgetting does the mind hold the possibility of renewal, the ability to see the world with fresh eyes again and again. And individuals with hypomnesia, on the other hand, who are sporadically described in the literature, suffer the torment of no longer being able to forget anything. They are exposed to a constant crossfire of mostly irrelevant memories, which they can hardly suppress. And thus it is precisely characteristic of our memory that it establishes a viable balance between remembering and forgetting. And finally, let us look at the enhancement of mood. One could think, well, who would blame people if they want to boost their happiness by pharmacological or technical means in view of all the hardship and the manifold frustrations of life? However, well-being, satisfaction, and happiness are the reward which nature holds for us, as it were. So they are the gain of effort and toil. And usually this gain is about in proportion to the expense that we have invested. Mountaineers know the quite different experience of happiness depending on whether they have climbed the mountain themselves or whether they have been carried up by a cable car. If well-being and happiness would be kept on a constant high level for free, as it were, then human striving for self-development and self-transcendence would weaken. Moreover, the experience of happiness itself would flatten out, since it would come about undeservedly and not as a satisfying result of one's own effort. At the same time, frustration tolerance would diminish, as overcoming resistances and setbacks would no longer be trained to the same degree. All this resembles very much the changes which may actually be observed in drug addicts in the long term. And let us finally think of Huxley's Brave New World, where the general intake of the mood-enhancing drug soma serves to provide a flat pleasure and sedation of the population. Such an enhancement seems hardly desirable, even if it were a voluntary measure and not decreed by the state. These examples should suffice to show that a remodeling of human nature is always accompanied by a high price, and we must pay it with the same coin we have seemingly just won. This applies also to the ultimate transhumanist vision, namely immortality. The prospect that nothing is final and that nothing is final any longer, that everything will be repeated forever, would rob humanity of all the treasure that it possesses in unique, irreplaceable, mortal life. In Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Immortal, the voyage to the immortal troglodytes leads the narrator to recognize that endless life means paralyzation by the external recurrence of the same. I quote from this story, "Everything among the mortals has the value of the irretrievable and the perilous, Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act and every thought is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, or the faithful presage of others that in the future will repeat it to a vertiginous degree. Nothing can happen only once. Nothing is precariously precarious. Hence, the experience of bliss, intensity, and presence would flatten out, for the colors of life only shine on the dark background of death. Moreover, each prolongation of life, even more its immortality, would abolish the balance between the generations, to the disadvantage of the descendants. For in order to avoid overpopulation, the immortality of those living would be bought with the necessary prevention of new life. And this means the renunciation of always beginning again with youth and renewal. Defying death, humanity would always further age, solidifying in current life forms, and would finally, in the repetition of ever the same, succumb to an all-overshadowing tiredness. To conclude, the supposedly human-friendly vision of transhumanism is nothing more than a dystopia. Based on a Neo-Gnostic dualism, it ignores the fundamentally antinomic structure of our existence, which, as an embodied and earthly existence, is necessarily characterized by polar terms. Transhumanists want to get rid of those polarities and antinomies. They think that there could be something like a pure mind, pure happiness, pure knowledge, or pure life. However, just as the mind may not be separated from the body, thus pleasure may not be divorced from pain, nor liberty from restriction, nor life from death. There is a nice passage in the foreword of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which I quote: "The light dove, in free flight cutting through the air, the resistance of which it feels, could get the idea that it could do even better in airless space." Well, but we know even birds need the resistance of air for their free locomotion. For movement is something bodily, and therefore it is subject to the polarity of embodied existence. Similarly, Kant goes on to argue a philosopher who would only dwell in the realm of pure ideas would only arrive at fruitless thoughts and empty figments of his imagination. Minds need resistance too. Hence, we cannot keep one of the poles of existence and get rid of the other. Indeed, even shifting the balance between them may have serious consequences, for it is characteristic of all naturally evolved polarities that they permit a high degree of variation and adaptivity. Through biologically shifting our capacities towards one pole, we would lose this flexibility and adaptivity. Thus, the idea of enhancement and optimization meets with inherent contradictions. And in the last analysis, the perfection of humanity could only be approached in a cultural and ethical sense, as the Enlightenment had actually intended. However, with the failure of the great utopias of the 20th century and the improvement of medical and digital technologies, the idea has spread of producing earthly happiness in a more banal, technical way, and of immediately transforming man into a happy, possibly immortal being. Trans and post-human utopias no longer wish to recognize the conditio humana, and no longer wish to accept the limitations and contradictions of human nature. One of the founders of posthumanism, Robert Ettinger, formulated this program in its full radicalness in the last century. Thus, humanity itself is a disease of which we must now proceed to cure ourselves, To do this, it must first be shown that Homo sapiens is only a botched beginning. When he clearly sees himself as an error, he may not only be motivated to sculpt himself, but also make at least a few swift and confident strokes. But the abolition of man by man is an absurd venture. And this is because it is precisely the corporeal, affective conditions of our existence which first give us primary values: birth, hunger, thirst, pain, desire, and death. Life is better than non-life. Nutrition is better than hunger. Proximity better than rejection. Love better than hate. This should not be, that is good. So we find the primary good because it is already inherent in our lives, in our embodied nature. We do not choose it at leisure. Without anchoring our wishes and values in human nature, we would lose this orientation, which lends meaning and sense to our lives. We could declare anything good or bad, as we could no longer say what the good is. And thereby the very concept of optimization would be rendered meaningless. As it were, there would no longer be an Archimedean point to which one could attach the post-human world. To conclude, what we need today is a defense of the human being. It is necessary to defend our corporeality, as well as our bodily nature, against their debasement, devaluation, or overcoming. Our corporality does not pretend to tell us what the good life is, the Aristotelian succeeding life. It does, however, give us better clues as to what this might be than any technically induced happiness. So let us then be satisfied with the conditio humana and its unavoidable imperfection. It may not be the best, but it is certainly not the worst thing that could have happened to us. Thank you very much for your attention.